Hi students, so we were going to record Danny doing a review today, but then I realized there's a lot of group work and that's not going to be super exciting for those of you watching it digitally. So I figured it might be easier if I just made a digital recording, but I'm going to have you pause lots of times in this video to work it out on your own as if you had been in class. And it's really up to you whether you do that or not, but I think that would be the most helpful. So this is just a quick review of days 2 through 4, which was nature of science and then evolution and the church. Okay, so for day 2, it was the nature of science. So if you remember in the exploratory activities, you did the termite activity. And so if you watched the videos, we drew this line with a pen, we put the termites on, and then they followed the line, which was very puzzling. And then we did a bunch of experiments to try to figure that out. And through that experience, you sort of learned what the whole process of scientific inquiry was. And then in the homework, you got a bunch of different examples like the leopard frogs and atrazine, and had to walk through what's a hypothesis, what's a prediction, what are your variables, etc. So these were the learning outcomes. So if you want to pause the video right here and just read through these and make sure you're comfortable, I would recommend that. So you should pause now. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. This is the same set of learning outcomes there on the left. This is the example I gave to students in class. So Jonathan is an avid snow skier. On his last ski trip, he broke his bindings and his skis are in the shop. So this time he rented skis from the lodge. He noticed that he seems to be a much faster skier on the rented skis. Sitting on the ski lift, he's contemplating this and wonders if maybe the ski shop waxes the skis before they rent them out, and maybe that's why he's faster, or it could be that these are straight and his own pair are parabolic. He'd love to get to the bottom of this. Can you help him? So we're going to walk through the scientific method with this. So I actually had students work in groups on this. And so I would ask you to pause the video right here and see if you can identify the puzzling observation, the causal question, the hypotheses. Then I want you to think about an experiment you might do, what prediction you would make, what the independent and dependent variables are, and what the results might look like, what your conclusions would be. Okay, so I want you to pause the video here and do that. Okay, and then I'm going to keep going. So if this were me, I'd say, okay, well, his puzzling observation is that, he's faster on his rented skis. So his causal question is, why am I faster on my rented skis? Okay, so the hypotheses should be answers to the causal question. So he's actually come up with 2. Maybe it's the wax, or maybe it's the straight skis versus parabolic. And so that's something that students often get confused, the hypothesis and the prediction. So the hypothesis is the answer to the causal question. Why is this happening? Okay, that's the answer. The prediction is what you're going to see in your experiment. So let's say if we're going to test the straight versus parabolic. So his hypothesis is that the straightness of the ski is what's causing the speed to increase. So he's going to try different varying sizes of skis, straight skis, parabolic skis, really parabolic skis, and he's going to time himself going down the mountain. Okay, and so if he's going to do that, then our prediction would be stated as this. If my hypothesis is correct, that it's the shape of the ski that matters, and I try straight versus parabolic skis, then I would predict that I should be faster on the straight skis than the parabolic skis. Okay, so the prediction is just what you should see in the experiment. And think about it, it doesn't make sense. Like if I were to say, I wonder why I'm faster, and you said, you'll be faster on straight skis. That doesn't make sense because the prediction is not the answer to the causal question. The prediction is what you'll see in your given experiment. This group will do better than this group. Okay? Okay, so that's my prediction. In that experiment, my independent variable, the one I'm manipulating, is the shape of the skis, whether they're straight or parabolic. And then the dependent, the one that's dependent on what I manipulated, is the speed of him going down the mountain. If that makes sense. All right, so let's say he does this experiment and he's way faster the straighter the ski is. Then he would compare those to his prediction, which is exactly what he predicted, and he would conclude hypothesis supported, that it's likely the shape of the ski. Okay, so that's an example of that. If you have questions, please come talk to me during office hours or the TAs during office hours. Okay, so then day 3 was the properties of life and types of evidence. So if you remember from the explorations, we looked at the MMR vaccine and autism and looking at how the original study that was done was very flawed. There was no control group. It was a very small sample size. There was no causal effect, so it was a simple correlation. And even today, the MMR vaccine, when you're given the MMR vaccine, heavily correlates to the age that we generally diagnose autism, and so it's just an unfortunate correlation. And I think I shared some other examples, but like, as hot dog sales go up, shark attacks go up. And that's a correlation, it's not causal. Okay, in order for it to be causal, you have to manipulate something. So then you watch this video on sugar and hyperactivity where they're actually manipulating something. They're giving the children sugar or non-sugared lollipops, and then they're tracking their behavior. And he talked about having a placebo-controlled trial where it's double blind, where nobody knows. And a lot of times you'll see correlational studies when ethics bar us from doing a causation study, right? So for example, with the MMR vaccine, we'd have to force people to take the vaccine, and that would be unethical. Or with smoking, right? Smoking and cancer. We know that it's bad for you, but we've never done a causation study in humans because we'd have to force people to smoke. So, and then you watch the cool roadkill experiment, which is one of this guy's, Mark Roberg, I believe, one of his first videos. He was so young. And then we looked at properties of life, right? That it can reproduce, that it's made of cells, that it can respond to the stimuli, that it adapts and evolves, that it can grow and develop. And a lot of times we throw in there that it can die. That's a good requirement for life. Okay, so these were the learning outcomes. If you want to pause here and just read through them and make sure you feel comfortable with them, that would be a good idea. So pause here. Okay, we'll keep going. These are those learning outcomes. Again, here's my examples. Okay, so number 1, scientists noticed that people in a certain region of Africa seem to have much lower malarial infection rates, so malaria, than other regions nearby. They hypothesized that a mutation in your hemoglobin gene, we'll call it HBC, confers immunity to malarial infection. So to test this, they sampled people from this certain region and people from other regions where malaria is much higher. They took blood, they analyzed their hemoglobin gene to look for this mutation. If their hypothesis is correct, what do they predict to see? Is this study correlational or causational? So once they found the results, they published them in the peer-reviewed journal JAMA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association. The New York Times then ran a story on the interesting results. The JAMA article is what type of source? The New York Times article is what type of source? And then explain why a seed is considered alive, listing all the properties of life it exhibits. Okay, so I would pause here and write your thoughts down so that you can compare them to what I'm about to say. Okay, so pause the video. Okay, so let's keep going. So this is a correlational study because we can't very rightly mutate people's DNA on purpose or expose them purposefully to malaria. So we're just looking at correlation. Okay, so that answers question 2, right? It's a correlation study, but they're thinking that if you have this HBC mutation, and this is a true story actually, if you have this HBC mutation, it's going to make you more immune to malaria. So if we looked at patients who have malaria and patients who don't have malaria, we should see a much higher incidence of this mutation in people who don't get malaria versus people who do. And so if we were really running a causal study, we would actually mutate this, right? Let's mutate it in mice or whatever. And so our independent variable, the one we're manipulating, is whether or not they have the mutation. And then the dependent variable, what depends on that, is whether or not they get malaria. Okay, so you can also identify an independent and dependent variable for correlation, but you'd have to imagine if I were to do this for real and manipulate it, what would I be manipulating? You wouldn't be manipulating whether or not they got malaria. That's just happens, right? You've been manipulating whether or not they have that mutation. So the study is correlational. So number 3, what type of sources? Remember, there's 3 types of sources, right? A primary source is one that is put out by the people who did the experiment, but it also requires some checks by the community. So it's peer reviewed. So it's sent out to other experts in the field, and they look at the research design and the methods and materials, and they decide whether they like it or not. This happens to me all the time, and then I have to fix things or clarify things. Okay, so it's got to be peer reviewed and put out by the primary authors of the study. And so the journal article from JAMA is a primary source. It's peer reviewed, put out by the people who did the experiment. But then the New York Times picks it up and they run a review of it. This is a secondary source. So the New York Times article is a secondary source. Now, secondary sources can be great. Textbooks are secondary sources, but you have to be careful because sometimes the people writing the secondary source will misquote the primary source. This happens all the time in popular news articles, so like the New York Times. I question everything they put out, and I've looked up lots of things they've cited, and they don't often do a very good job. So that's a secondary source. The other source would be anecdotal. This would be like if somebody came to you and said, hey, I took a lot of vitamin C and I didn't get malaria. Okay. It's a story, right? And then the last one, number 4, why is a seed considered alive? Well, it can grow and develop. It can reproduce. It is using energy, just very small amounts because it's mostly dormant. It's made of cells. It can die, and it will die. That's why seeds have expiration dates. It can respond to stimuli. If you put water on it, it will grow. And over time, these populations do adapt and evolve. So that's number 4. Okay, so if you have any questions on that day, please come talk to me or a TA. Okay, so then day 4 was evolution of the church. There was no homework for this. I just had you watch a video where I talk about how this fits with church doctrine. I know that a lot of people feel a little uncomfortable learning about evolution, and by no fault of your own, there's a lot of cultural history that I go through in the video that makes people feel like maybe the church is against evolution. But it turns out the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, at least, is neutral towards evolution, meaning that they don't have an official statement and that you are totally free and open to form your own opinions and to investigate the evidence. So in this class, we're just going to go through the evidence and then you can make the decision for yourself. But one of the things we talked about is the difference between how science is done and how religion is done, right? And so if evolution really is a thing, can it fit with my religious beliefs? So I talk about this a lot in the video. This little book that I show you is the fun one that my son made in sacrament meetings. So it's got the book of plants on one side and the book of God on the other side. And on the inside, it had a scripture and then a list of plants he was going to plant in his garden. And so for him, the book of God and the book of nature don't conflict in any way, shape, or form. And I hope that that's the case for you. But again, I would encourage you to watch that video, read the official statements of the church. Religion and science are just 2 different ways of getting at the same truth. So just 2 different angles of coming to the same truth. And I would love to talk to you more about this. If you have any questions at all about this, please feel free to reach out to me. Come to my office hours, come in person, we'll sit and chat about it. And then this is just a fun little activity. I'll just walk you through it really fast. There's a lot of ways to think about the creation and a lot of people who have come up with a lot of ways of looking at the creation. And so I've made a list here of some of the most common things, common ideas that we've seen. And so I'm just going to go through each of them. So flat earthers, believe it or not, there are still flat earthers today, and they have a whole society and they run science experiments to prove that the earth is flat. Then geocentrism is the belief that the earth is the center of the universe. Obviously, we haven't really had that around for a long time. The universal model is kind of a newer one that's come out that is bizarre, for lack of a better term. I almost didn't include it because it's almost so ridiculous that it shouldn't be on the slide. But it's the idea that among other things, but the earth is really young and that fossils can be formed in 2 weeks and that the center of the earth is water. It's where Noah's flood waters went. Anyway, that's that one. Young earth creationism, obviously, is the belief that the earth was created less than 10,000 years ago in the order interpreted from Genesis, right? Intelligent design, this one's also kind of an odd one and recent one. The idea that life is too complex. There's no way that evolution could have formed life. In my mind, this is putting limits on God, because why couldn't he use evolution? Who are you to say? But the idea is that organisms, they exhibit such complexity that there must have been an intelligent designer behind it. But they don't actually claim that intelligent designer is God. It could be an alien. It could be anything. But really, it is kind of a way of getting young earth creationism in again. Gap creationism is the belief that it was literal 24-hour periods that Earth was created, but there were big gaps of time in between. So this kind of accounts for like the fact that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Age creationism is the belief again that it took place in periods of time, but not necessarily 24 hours, that there were just 6 epochs of time of unknown length that the creation took place. Progressive creationism is the belief that God created everything, but in sort of the time we see in the fossil record, but that each organism that arose was created by the hand of God. So just all along the way, up until present day. Theistic evolution is the belief that modern diversity arose through evolution just the way we explain it in science, but that God was guiding the process, that it was purposeful. Agnostic evolution is the belief that modern day diversity arose through evolution, just the way we see it in science, and we have no idea if God was involved or not. Agnosticism is a lack of belief in God or not God. And then we have atheistic evolution, so the belief that modern day diversity arose through evolution and that necessarily voids God, that God cannot exist. Okay, so those are the ideas. So I want you to pause here for just a minute, and I want you to see, where would you draw the line between young Earth and old Earth, right? Which ones will support the idea that the Earth could be old? And then where would you draw the line between scientifically compatible, so compatible with the scientific evidence we have, or not? And then where would you draw the line of those that are scientifically compatible but rely on faith in something that we have no scientific evidence for? Okay, so those are the three questions right there. I would really love for you to pause the video for just a second and think about that. Okay, and then we'll keep going. So generally, people put the young Earth, old Earth line somewhere around here, because if you have gaps in time, you could have an old Earth. Intelligent design, it depends on who you talk to, actually, in the intelligent design camp. Some are okay with an old Earth and some are not. So somewhere in there, it's a gray area, no pun intended for my gray graphic. As far as scientifically compatible, oh, that's young Earth, old Earth. Scientifically compatible, it depends. Okay, so I have kind of a potentially scientifically compatible, because it depends on how literally you're going to take these. Because the day age, or the progressive creationism, for instance, could it be that each thing arose by an act of God, right? There would be no way to, I guess, tell that away from the fossil evidence, but there's sure a lot of evidence that things evolved over time and changed from one thing into another. But anyway, so those are potentially compatible. I hope that you can see that the last three are definitely scientifically compatible, right? Theistic, agnostic, atheistic. All scientifically compatible. They're looking at the evidence that exists, that science has uncovered, and saying, yep, that's totally realistic. The difference is I either believe that God was directing it, or I have no belief either way, or I believe that this destroys God. Okay? So those are scientifically compatible. But if we talk about what ones rely on faith, both of those rely on faith in something that we don't have scientific evidence for, right? So theistic evolution and atheistic evolution. I think you probably didn't think about that atheistic evolution is just as much a belief system as theistic evolution, right? You are believing that God does not exist, and there's no evidence that God does not exist, but there's also no scientific evidence that God does exist. There's certainly other evidence that we as believers can certainly cite, right? But it's not scientific evidence. So science, what I want to emphasize here is that science is agnostic. Science does not make any rulings either way on whether God exists or not. And unfortunately, a lot of scientists make that ruling, but they shouldn't, right? Because science is agnostic. Science is not a belief system. So hopefully you got that out of my video too, but I just wanted to re-emphasize that here so that you feel comfortable that all we're talking about in science is the facts that we can find around us and the explanations we've come up with that seem most compatible with the evidence. Whether God was involved or not a question for science at all. Okay, so that's the end of the review. Again, like I said, if you have any questions at all, please come talk to me, because I'd love to chat with you about this issue. I do a lot of research on it, and my ultimate goal is to preserve your testimony. Right? So that's my biggest goal here. So if you're having any issues where you're doubting, please don't doubt your faith. Come talk to me. We'll talk about it. All right? Okay. Thanks.